I thought I'd just start with your thoughts of the media itself at the moment. So why do you think the media, the Western media, the American, British, whichever you see fit, is so incapable of telling the truth? Is it the advertisers? Is it just knowing the boundaries, self-censorship, access to these politicians, or is it the network or people outside the network telling them not to? What are your thoughts on this?
To all of those possibilities, I would say yes, 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 and yes. I think there are a number of different factors that play into this. But speaking from my own personal experience, I would say if, growing up in Canada in the 1980s, 1990s, obviously, I think it's quite obvious, at least to me in retrospect, and I think I did suspect it at the time, that the media was controlled in various ways, that there are certain subjects that just could not be talked about, and certain pieces of information that just couldn't be aired in polite society, like the absurd speculation that Lee Harvey Oswald was not a lone nut or something along those lines, despite the fact that I was cognizant, even as a young boy, many people have questions about that. But if you ask a question, you're just an insane wingnut or something like that. So the disconnect between reality and what was being reported and shown on TV or in the newspapers was obvious to me from a young age. But having said that, comparing it to the way that it is today, that discrepancy seems to have grown orders of magnitude vaster in the past decade or two. And I don't know if there's an acceleration that is going on, but certainly as to the whys, why does this take place? I think it's quite obvious, presumably to your audience by now at any rate, that this does take place. But why does it take place? And you mentioned several different factors, all of which I think do play into this. I think the most obvious explanation for this, and the one that I think is easiest understood by pretty much everybody, is the monetary incentive. The corporate media has a literal vested interest in reporting on some things, not reporting on other things that would be beneficial to their shareholders or their board members. And that's pretty obvious, I think. So, for example, when GE took over NBC, and you got the conspiracy theory rock on Saturday Night Live talking about how, GE has taken over NBC and they don't want you talking about nuclear weapons and things like this, being revealed on Saturday Night Live as a ha ha ha, isn't this funny? And it was never aired again. Yeah, there may be a reason for that. There may be certain things that maybe GE does not want reported on its media mouthpiece. So that basic monetary incentive, I think, again, is pretty explanatory and does go a far way towards explaining a lot of the types of censorship that we see, but not all the way. And there are other types of media entities that exist as well, not just corporate entities, but of course, government-funded entities. So, of course, in Canada, there was the CBC. In Britain, there's the BBC. There are various public broadcasters around the world. And there are other public broadcasters that are funded by listeners and other things. So it's not simply the monetary incentive, although I think that is a large part of it. There are many layers at which we could look at this, but I guess I want to drill down to the base of all of this, the basic layer, which is something that I attempted to do in a couple of things that I released last year. For example, my Media Matrix documentary, which was sort of a condensation of the main points of a 6-hour lecture series that I delivered, an online course that's available right now, on the history of mass media. And in that, I wasn't just looking at the history of mass media in a historiological sort of dry academic way. It was an attempt to explore the philosophical basis of what is media, mass media especially, and how does it function and why does it function this way? And when you look at it from that perspective, I think you see the bigger story here, which is the incredible, almost incomprehensible from our point of view, revolution that took place with the birth of the movable type printing press and the incredible explosion of information that took place in the wake of that invention. Obviously, manuscripts existed before Gutenberg, but the widespread access to books and literature and philosophy and news did not exist before the movable type printing press, not in the way that we understand it today. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it was something like all of the scribes in all of Europe were able to produce something like 20,000 manuscripts in the first half of the 15th century. But in the second half of the 15th century, after the advent of the movable type printing press, it was something like 12 million books. And that orders of magnitude more information spreading freely obviously was going to have incredibly profound effects on society. And that's why I think you can make a pretty good case that the movable type printing press is probably the most important invention of the past millennium. And probably, I think demonstrably had impacts on such things as the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. All of these things were predicated on the movable type printing press. And because of the incredible ability of this technology to shape or reshape society, people who have an interest in preserving the status quo or in gaining power or in using power to manipulate other people obviously have an interest in controlling that technology. So in my course, for example, I paint the picture from the movable type printing press, the Gutenberg Revolution, towards the Morgan conspiracy, which was something I talk about in the early part of the 20th century, by the point at which the movable type printing press, which was a complicated piece of, I mean, there was a lot going on, especially given that it was created before the Industrial Revolution. There was no machine parts or anything like that. It was all handmade, but it was still possible for your average craftsman and workman to be able to put together something like that and basically have a small printer. And that's the way, for example, the American Revolution was able to, common sense and these other pamphlets and tracts could be written and then distributed to millions of people in a way that would have been unthinkable in a prior age. But then by the advent of the 18th, 19th, 20th century, you start to get the rotary press and these other more complicated capital-intensive technologies and distribution networks for newspapers and things. It started to become quite capital-intensive. And unless you were a rich inheritor of your father's wealthy estate, which is the case for a lot of the early media tycoons, actually. But eventually it started to consolidate into a business, the business of media. And I think that's what we really saw in the 20th century. And if you chart the history of the 20th century in terms of the development of mass media and start to look at the way that these corporations start to form around the basis of commercializing and making commodifying news and information, which again is something that probably would have been unthinkable even a few hundred years ago. But now we're in this space where news and information becomes this commodity that can be bought and sold and traded and broadcast to the masses and used, obviously, to manipulate people. Exactly as, I suppose, every writer, every person who engages in mass media is trying to get their ideas out to other people. That's sort of the nature of what this is. But because it was so incredibly successful before anyone really understood what was happening, I think people tried to cotton on to that. So that's how we arrive in the 21st century with these gigantic media monopolies that are suddenly in some degree of danger because, all these disruptive technologies are essentially Gutenberg 2.0, the printing press of our age, the internet revolution, and people talking to each other and not going to CNN or these few handful of media corporations to get their news. That truly is a revolutionary moment. And I think that's exactly why we see so much crackdown coming right now. And I think that's part of why we see that gulf widening between what we know to be objective reality and what is being reported is widening, because I think they are losing sort of the information control that they have enjoyed in previous ages. So I think they have to cling even more firmly into their techniques of gaslighting and manipulating the public, at least that section of the public that still listens to them, which is a dwindling section of the public.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. There's multiple reasons. If you take Amy Robach from ABC, where she was calling that leak tape talking about the Jeffrey Epstein story before it came out, that ABC or Disney squashed it and said, who's Jeffrey Epstein? They could obviously done one search result and obviously they knew who he was. Or you could look at John Kerry, where he got caught in a leaked audio in 2016 saying that the US watched ISIS grow. They thought they could manage it and use it as a leverage against Assad, basically to overthrow a government, and that Russia and Putin came in. And only 3 organizations even reported on there was a leak tape. It was CNN, The Guardian, and the New York Times. They were the only ones who reported on the leak tape, but they left out that detail. And the New York Times one was the best, because they put bits of audio in their article so you could listen, but they wouldn't post the full thing. And I went to the video, and they literally used bits just after, and someone obviously heard that, and they thought, the US watched ISIS grow. Could be the biggest story of the 21st century, especially after 9/11, all the wars, and they didn't report it. You know, to a normal person, how can you possibly explain that? Surely that's a huge story. So there's obviously lots of different reasons. I'm sure you're aware of those leak tapes.
I am indeed. Those are great examples. In fact, the Amy Robach leaked audio of her talking about the squelching of the Epstein story was my fake news story of the year for 2019, I believe, or 20, or whenever that occurred. Obviously that's a prime example of the way that this operates. And you're exactly right. In one sense, it does seem to be against interest, because the type of pushback that has always existed against these crazy conspiracies, there can't be a conspiracy. The free press in the free Western world can't be controlled, because if somebody had the inside scoop on 9/11 inside job, or ISIS was allowed to form, or something along those lines, and they went and broadcast, and they'd get all the attention and all the viewership and all the advertising and all the money. So of course there's this incentive for anyone to break stories like that rather than cover them up. So you're crazy. That would never happen. And yet it demonstrably has. For example, in those cases that you lay out. Why would it happen? This is where that monetary explanation starts to break down, because to a certain extent there is. Obviously, if somebody came out and was breaking all these incredible stories, there would be a monetary incentive in that, unless the board members and people in editorial positions actually had interest in certain stories not breaking for a number of reasons. One prime example, as we are recording this conversation, what is happening in Davos right now, the World Economic Forum, and who is at the World Economic Forum? Of course, a lot of journalists, but as attendees of the World Economic Forum, not as journalists reporting on what's going on and let's get you the inside. No, they're stenographers who are going to be lapdogs to the World Economic Forum, again, for a multitude of reasons, some of them probably for just basic personal reasons of, I'm hobnobbing with the elite, I'm an important person, or people who want access to certain people and know that if they say certain things, they won't get that access in the future, the pay-to-play system and all of this. It happens. And again, as you say, there are many reasons for this, but it's so much more vast than I think most people understand. And there are trivial examples of this, I suppose, but then there are extremely important examples that you gesture to some of them. I'm sure everyone can think of other examples where the press, in its role of directing our attention, because that is essentially what it does, what the mainstream media conversation becomes what people think about. And that is one of the most important powers that any tyrant throughout history could have ever dreamt of having, to be able to control people at the level of what they think about. Because by that, you can direct entire societies in ways that would be utterly, just totally madness if looked at from an objective standpoint. Case in point, the past 3 years. Can you imagine if instead of having the COVID death count on every channel and the pie charts and the, oh my God, how many people died today? Imagine if they were doing that about, say, I don't know, car accidents, car deaths. Oh my God, another 47 people died on the roads today. We have to do something about this. The exact same hype and panic could be used to direct people's attention to that or to the other thing. But no, it was directed in this particular way because, again, there are a number of people with their interests lying in this particular erection of the biosecurity state agenda that's playing out right now. So I think that's the prime example that we've all just lived through of people's attention being directed in a certain way for certain nefarious ends, quite effectively, unfortunately, through the control of the corporate media.
Yeah, you could say the same about putting people's obviously attention to Russia and Ukraine, basically every day. But not Yemen. Most people wouldn't even have a clue, obviously, what's going on there. And obviously, that's quite a brutal war in itself. And before we start moving on to your episode, I just had a couple more questions. So, especially in the COVID era and the Russia-Ukraine one, you see each media organization, when they write an article, it almost looks identical, like it's press releases, especially, front pages of newspapers. I'm sure that always happened. But they always seem to be so similar. And a specific example I remember is when Joe Rogan came out and said he used ivermectin, along with basically 14 other things that obviously wasn't discussed. And every American, it was more a Sky reported it, but the British didn't really go for it. He's an American guy, isn't he? But everyone, Reuters, AP, all of them, CNN, it was just like identical. Why do you think they are? That is?
Part of that actually goes to the roots of that the commodification of news and information that I was talking about earlier. Because you talk about AP. What is AP? It's the Associated Press. It is a wire news agency, which the way that people can understand this is probably from those the viral clips that people have seen by now of people putting all of these different newscasters from all of these different local channels all saying the exact same thing, almost as if it was scripted, right? But no, it's my local news reporter who's saying this. So you can see those types of mashups that have been made. And I think that blows people's minds because they don't understand that most news these days really is centralized. So if you look at the development of the wire agencies in the 19th century, it is a fascinating story in and of itself. But essentially the advent of telegraphy enabled the ability for essentially businesses to arise that would commodify news by placing agents in various key European capitals, of course, was where it first originated. And they would be able to, for example, if you're in London, you'd be able to get reports from Berlin and Paris and elsewhere around Europe of news that just happened yesterday when you're reading it in your morning newspaper. It's incredible. And of course, a valuable service, right? What could go wrong with that? But of course, then, as I say, it starts to centralize around the few basic wire agencies that are then sending the exact same stories out all around their circuit, whether that's Europe or at this point, the world, like the Associated Press. And suddenly you have all of these local news reports and newspapers and news channels and news websites that all have the exact same stories reported in the exact same way. That's the most obvious way in which we can understand the sort of centralization of the script, as it were. I think there are more nefarious ways at work as well, and they could be conceptualized around, again, I think most of the people who work in the news industry probably genuinely are not actively part of or think of themselves as part of some conspiracy to suppress news, but exactly as it has been observed, if these anchors and these reporters were not the type of people who knew how to steer away from Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone nut. There are certain things that as a reporter, you don't talk about. You don't go into that. You don't start digging things up in certain places. And if you know what places to avoid, you will be the type of reporter who will be promoted, and eventually maybe you can be the news anchor, etc. So I think that's how this functions on that level. The real question then is the editorial level and what's above the editorial level. And I think that's where the real power is flowing from this. But it's about the centralization and the commodification of this that means the standardization of news, exactly as you talked about, where you can be reading essentially literally the exact same text, or sometimes the exact same story just said in a different way, unfortunately.